everyone, welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. The G20 summit in Johannesburg, the first to be held on the African continent, has now officially come to a close. South Korea is set to assume the rotating G20 presidency in 2028. After high-level talks between the United States and Ukraine in Geneva, Washington says a tremendous amount of progress has been made in talks to finalize a peace deal to end the war. Kyiv also called the talks positive, saying there are signs the Trump team is listening. New satellite images reportedly show North Korea is continuing to modernize and expand its Yongbyon nuclear complex, the regime's main source of plutonium and enriched uranium. We begin this morning in South Africa, where this year's G20 summit has now come to a close. On the final day of the multilateral gathering, President Lee Jae-myung laid out his vision for artificial intelligence and stable supply chains. Our presidential office correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
Critical minerals and AI were the overarching themes during the third and final session of the G20 summit in South Africa. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung was among the world leaders to share his visions with the theme of a fair and just future for all, starting off by welcoming the G20's announcement of the AI for Africa initiative.
특히 금년 APEC 의장국으로서 이런 정신을 반영한 APEC AI 이니셔티브가 아태 지역을 넘어 전 세계로 확산될 수 있도록 노력하겠습니다.
With the world facing increasing uncertainties over critical minerals amid the U.S.-China rivalry, President Lee also called for the need to establish a stable supply chain. He noted this year's G20 critical minerals framework and South Korea's role as the chair of the Minerals Security Partnership.
앞으로도 고혜적인 공급망 구축을 위한 국제적 노력을 계속 해 나갈 것입니다.
He went on to say that those efforts should be translated into benefiting all, particularly young people and women, as he noted Korea's contribution when it comes to building AI digital learning centers for the vulnerable. This year's G20 summit was unusual in more than one way. It was the first to be held in Africa, and the group of 20 leaders adopted a declaration on the first day of the summit, not the last, stressing the importance of multilateralism. Some of the world leaders were absent, including U.S. President Donald Trump. With this, the first round of the G20 rotating presidency was completed. South Korea will take over the rotating presidency in 2028.
막중한 책임감으로 G20가 국제 경제 협력을 위한 최상위 포럼으로 그 위상을 더욱 공고히 할 수 있도록 주어진 역할을 충실하게 이행하겠습니다.
President Lee now heads to Turkey, the final leg of his four-nation trip to the Middle East and Africa, for a summit with his Turkish counterpart. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News, Johannesburg.
And staying in Johannesburg, President Lee Jae-myung has pledged to improve the overseas voting system for Korean nationals living in South Africa. During a luncheon with some 70 Korean residents on Sunday, President Lee acknowledged that some residents have had to travel as much as 1,400 kilometers to cast their ballots due to the lack of nearby polling stations. To address the issue, he proposed introducing an electronic voting system for overseas Koreans. Now, this was the first meeting of its kind between a South Korean president and the Korean community in South Africa since the two countries established diplomatic relations in 1992. So the G20 summit in Johannesburg, the first to be held in Africa, has now come to an end. And in 2028, the G20 summit will be held here in South Korea for the first time in 18 years. For more on this, we're joined today by Professor Mason Ritchie, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor Ritchie, thanks for joining us this morning. So, throughout the G20 summit, President Lee addressed a lot of issues. He talked about AI, stable supply chains, and about the revitalization of the WTO. as well as, the need for stronger international cooperation to make development projects in developing nations more effective. What are your thoughts on his comments?
That's fine on its own. I think that that's a sort of a useful kind of thing to broach. But I don't necessarily see why the WTO should be the privileged driver for that. That's typically the sort of thing that one would imagine doing through the World Bank or through regional development banks. So I'm not exactly sure what the specifics of that type of proposal would be, given the nature of that institution, which is really primarily about trade regulations. That being said, of course, the WTO is in many respects dysfunctional at the moment. I won't say totally moribund, but clearly is functioning at way below the level that it was sort of intended to, notably, essentially because of in the first place, the United States rejecting the international arbitration function that the World Trade Organization has. And then secondly, as we've seen the United States and China move into their much more predatory trade model, the WTO has largely been sidelined. So anything, I suppose, that makes the WTO more relevant, might be something worth doing. And I guess to some degree, at these multilateral meetings, if regional powers like South Korea, middle powers, can hatch together ideas in a G20 format and try to see them through, I think that that's useful for making up for some of the deficiencies of the international order right now.
I see. And this year's G20 summit closed without a ceremonial handover to the United States, its next chair, after President Donald Trump boycotted the meeting. And it also broke with tradition by issuing a leader's declaration on the opening day of the talks instead of at the very end. What's the overall assessment of this year's G20 meeting?
Well, I think that the chair this year of the G20 was caught in a hot off mic moment saying that it was really difficult, that it was a real struggle this year for lots and lots of different reasons, of course. Just from the sort of optic standpoint, the fact that there was no Trump and no Xi there in some respects diminishes the G20 a little bit. Although at least China was represented, which of course the United States was not. It essentially boycotted this G20 due to some ginned up fake race issue. And I think that really shows some of the dysfunction in US politics and also the sort of larger disdain right now that the US has for multilateralism. The G20 didn't really contribute much to the Russia-Ukraine discourse. All that's happening in terms of what's being hatched out in this supposed, in scare quotes, peace plan. All that's being hatched out between Moscow and Washington, and to some degree, apparently, Europe and Kyiv now, not at the G20. So that sort of security and side of the equation doesn't really seem to be particularly functional. And then the trade related issues, globally speaking, which the G20 is supposed to sort of have right in its wheelhouse, is of course largely being dominated again by the predatory trade practices of China and the US. So there again, I think we see some of the weakness of the G20. And as I said, the G20 is struggling. And so I guess the best that we can hope for right now is that, as I said, these middle powers, regional powers like South Korea, Japan, South Africa, et cetera, that they work together to sort of build some additional parts of the international order that have frayed so noticeably over the last decade.
See, and on the sidelines of that summit in Johannesburg, President Lee Jae-myung also met with leaders of France and Germany yesterday. What do you make of those meetings?
Frankly, I was, at least from the news coverage that you're getting of the Lee meeting with Friedrich Merz, the federal chancellor of Germany, disappointed and almost irritated at the way that this meeting at least was reported, where it focused so much on the talk about the lessons that Germany has for Korean unification. This is fantasy land, and this is not, I think, the right thing for South Korea to be talking to Germany about. And maybe there's more going on behind closed doors, but at least the reporting talked so much about the lessons that Germany has for unification. There's so many other things that need to be dealt with right now. There's an international trade order that needs to be rebuilt. There arms that need to be sold into the European arms market. There's climate change to be mitigated. There are critical minerals to be mined and refined. And to be talking about unification right now, it just doesn't seem like a very productive use of time. Maybe there was more going on behind the scenes. And then as for France, the upgrading of the Korea-France relationship is, I think, a good thing, of course. And space cooperation, I think, notably is an area where there's some real upside there, and that, of course, made it onto the agenda, and that's good. Macron visiting for the 140th anniversary of diplomatic ties in 2026, I think, is good, and maybe provide some impetus for some further cooperation, not only with France, but Europe more generally. And I really hope that this is more of what we'll see from the Blue House going forward, is that there will be increased attention to Europe, and that Europe will be taken more seriously as an economic and security partner. Of course, also requires Europe to stand up and do some of those things itself. But I hope that these types of meetings will help propel that relationship forward.
Right, absolutely. All right, Professor Rich, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for having me.
And as President Lee Jae-myung heads to Ankara, Arirang News spoke with Turkey's ambassador to South Korea to hear his hopes and expectations for bilateral ties going ahead. Our foreign affairs correspondent Oh Soo-young reports.
South Korea and Turkey's centuries-old brotherhood is now powering major partnerships in future industries as President Lee Jae-myung begins his visit to Ankara. Turkey's ambassador to South Korea, Murat Tamer, says the visit marks a turning point, grounded in a relationship deeper than most bilateral ties.
Because it will be a first visit of the Korean president, I believe, after 16 or some years. And Turkey and Korea, as you know, we consider each other as blood brothers, and we have many things in common. We have share a joint past history, and there's many things we can do together, like two like-minded countries in the two ends of this continent of Asia.
The ambassador says with the meeting of the two leaders, he hopes to see concrete advances in energy, defense and economic cooperation.
Based on the Korea-Turkey FTA, our bilateral trade has now reached $11 billion. And how do you hope to see economic cooperation go forward?
I have to tell you that our economics are not alternative to each other. Turkey and Korea, our economies are complementary to each other. So we can work together in many fields. One of them is the nuclear project, that it will be what I always say, that it will be the jewel of the crown of Turkish-Korean relations, because one Korean minister told me that the nuclear project is a friendship for 100 years. Well, we've been friends for Korea for 1,500 years. No reason to add 100 years more. Why not? It will be cooperation for many fields, from the construction sector to the chemicals to the services. It will just open up many business opportunities on win-win basis for both of our countries.
Ankara is positioning itself as a strategic gateway for Korean firms seeking access to other large markets.
First of all, Turkey is in the position of its proximity. It's very near to Balkans, Europe, Gulf countries, Central Asia. For example, about 4 or 5 hours flight, you can reach just about 800 million people within the reach. So it's a very good hub for the Korean companies. Secondly, Turkey and the European Union, we have a customs union agreement. So anything produces in Turkey can be sent to Europe without any custom duties.
Defense cooperation is also expanding. Ankara is producing the Turkish version of Korea's K9 Thunder howitzer and developing its own main battle tank using components derived from the K2 platform. The ambassador says the next step is drones, an area where Turkey is now a global leader.
Turkey has the 65% of the world drone market now. So we like our Korean brothers to have that capability. Of course, when you think about drone, you always think about military means, but drones are also used for the civilians, for the forest fires, for the search and rescue operations.
Collaboration comes naturally to the two brother nations, which he said can create marvels.
As you mentioned, Korea and Turkey sit on the opposite ends of Eurasia, but during your 3 years here, how have you been bringing these strategic interests together?
First of all, what Korea taught me is distance is not that important as long as you have the same feeling, same heart. And when I come to Korea, I didn't realize that how the Korean people feel about Turkey. And I devoted myself to further deepen increasing our already existing bilateral relations in the field of economics, in the field of culture, in the field of political relations and commerce as well. Yes, we had some challenges, but we did a lot also in this 3 years period.
The two countries share a rare sense of togetherness, also reflected in their cooperation through MICTA, the five-nation middle power grouping of Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey and Australia. But shared values and solidarity between Korea and Turkey date back centuries.
People think that Turkish-Korean relations started in 1950s in Korean War. Well, actually, it's not the whole truth. Our relations started about 1,500 years ago when we lived side by side in the central, in the near Mongolia and China. So when Turkish soldiers came to Korea in 1950s, they did not come to the total different land or the different people. They just come to aid to their friends they know 1,500 years ago.
With high expectations for President Yi's visit, Tamer says he hopes to see both sides further building on one of Eurasia's oldest and most enduring friendships. Young, Arirang News.
Washington says it has made major progress toward crafting a plan to end the war in Ukraine, following high-level talks in Geneva on Sunday. Kyiv also called the Sunday's talks productive, hoping for a fair peace deal. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
The United States says it has made significant progress toward crafting a plan to end the war in Ukraine, following high-level talks in Geneva on Sunday. Washington says momentum is building, even as several sensitive issues remain unresolved. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio led the American delegation in negotiations with senior Ukrainian officials as both sides work to refine a peace proposal first outlined by President Donald Trump. The talks took place amid concerns in Kyiv and across Europe about parts of the U.S.-backed draft, which some allies view as offering major concessions to Russia. Rubio said negotiators had narrowed down outstanding issues within a 28-point draft plan, calling the progress substantial.
We arrived here today with one goal, and the goal was to take, is 28 points or 26 points, depending on which version as it continued to evolve, and try to narrow the ones that were open items. And we have achieved that today in a very substantial way. Now,
he said technical experts from both sides are now working to finalize remaining provisions and that the document could form the basis for a final settlement. Rubio acknowledged, however, that critical questions still need agreement, including the future roles of NATO and the European Union and how to ensure lasting security guarantees for Ukraine. He stressed that none of these issues are impossible to resolve and voiced confidence that the gap between the sides can be closed. Washington hopes a breakthrough can be reached soon. Rubio said the Trump administration aims to finalize an agreement by Thursday. Ukraine gave a similar assessment. Presidential Chief of Staff Andriy Yermak called the first meeting with the American delegation highly productive, saying both sides are working toward a fair and lasting peace. He added that Kyiv will coordinate with European partners in the days ahead and emphasized that the ultimate decision will rest with both presidents. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said it is positive that Ukraine is engaged in direct dialogue with the U.S. delegation and that there are signs the Trump team is listening.
It is important that we do talk to the Americans, and we are getting signals that President Trump's team is hearing us.
With talks set to continue, Zelensky said Monday will be a busy day as Ukraine continues to defend its interests. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
In other news, a new report says North Korea has continued to modernize and expand its main nuclear complex throughout this year. According to U.S.-based monitoring website 38 North on Sunday, satellite images from October and November show continued construction across the Yongbyon nuclear complex, the regime's main source of plutonium and enriched uranium. The group reports heightened activity at a suspected enrichment site northeast of the radiochemical lab, including the completion of 2 support buildings, new concrete paving, and installation of 6 possible heat exchangers to cool centrifuges inside the main building. The report added that the improvements all serve to help fulfill Kim Jong-un's call for exponential growth of his nuclear weapons arsenal. And over in China, the country is stepping up its criticism of Japan after Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi suggested Tokyo could intervene in the event of heightened conflict between China and Taiwan. Following a four-nation tour of Central Asia, China's top diplomat Wang Yi said Japan had crossed a red line, emphasizing regional support for Beijing's stance against Taiwanese independence. China has also taken its complaints to the United Nations and the IAEA, accusing Japan of challenging its core interests and questioning its commitment to non-nuclear principles. Additionally, at the G20 summit, the Chinese and Japanese premiers avoided any interaction.
Good morning, I'm Chi Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. In the United States, New York City Mayor-elect Zoran Mamdani reaffirmed that he still believes President Donald Trump is a fascist, just 2 days after a surprisingly cordial meeting at the White House. In an interview aired on NBC News on Sunday, Mamdani said, quote, "Everything I have said in the past, I continue to believe," adding that he would not shy away from political disagreements. The comment came even though both men had pledged to cooperate on housing and cost of living issues during their meeting last week. Trump, who previously called Mamdani a communist lunatic, said he didn't mind the label and emphasized that he wants New York to do very well. Senior White House officials also said the administration plans to work with Mamdani despite clear policy differences. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has confirmed that its top military commander, Haytham Ali Tabtabai, was killed in a high-impact strike in Beirut by Israel on Sunday, in its first attack on the Lebanese capital in months. Hezbollah said Israel's killing of its chief of staff had crossed a red line. According to Lebanon's health ministry, at least 5 people were killed and 28 wounded after the strike hit an apartment building in Beirut's densely populated Dahae district. Israel says the operation targeted a senior figure rebuilding the group's military capabilities. The strike comes despite a ceasefire brokered by the U.S. and France in November of last year. In Nigeria, 50 of the 315 students kidnapped from St. Mary's School in Niger State on Friday have escaped and have been reunited with their families. However, a military-led search and rescue operation is continuing for the remaining 265 students and 12 teachers taken when gunmen stormed the school. The latest abduction case prompted Niger State to close all schools in the area. A similar kidnapping in Kebbi State last Monday has raised fears of targeted school hunting by armed groups. Nigeria has been dealing with a kidnapping crisis since 2014, with more than 2,500 students taken.
The last work week of November starts with much warmer air across much of Korea. But rain early this week will bring temperatures to the more seasonal side. And until this afternoon, central regions could see about 5 millimeters of light precipitation. Chungcheongdo provinces could see less than 1 millimeter. Meanwhile, nationwide rain is expected for tomorrow, which should help to ease the dryness on the east coast. And this afternoon, Seoul gets up to 17 degrees Celsius. Gwangju will be topping out at 19 degrees, Busan, Jeju at 20 degrees. Meanwhile, most of the central regions will be dealing with unhealthy fine dust levels for most of the day, and the air quality will worsen further south later in the day. After the rain moves away, many places will drop below freezing on Thursday. Then we're expecting Nuri rocket on Thursday. However, the nationwide rain is expected on the same day, though there might be some changes to that outlook.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.